Today, we are going to talk a little bit about leading in times of crisis. Given the current situation we are in, I think this is a very important topic and top of mind for a lot of us who are product managers. A little bit about myself. I am Deotima Mukherjee. I am a product manager at Instagram. I work on the Instagram for Business team where we make sure that people have relevant, high quality experiences with the businesses that they see on Instagram. My previous experience has been in e-commerce, and I have worked at companies like Net-a-Porter and Levi's, where I have worked at the intersection of consumer-facing products and machine learning. Why is it important to understand the topic of how you should lead in a crisis? Well, to start with, a crisis can look really different for employees and leaders. As a product manager, the things you're experiencing may not be the same challenges that your team is experiencing. So making sure that you have empathy and that you're communicating clearly and protecting your team in a time of crisis is really important in determining what the future of your work looks like. The second one in a crisis is that it does impact a team's motivation. It impacts retention in terms of who decides to stay on your team on leave. And ultimately, if your people are not happy and they're not productive, it does impact the profitability of your product and the company. Learning how to manage a crisis effectively can be really powerful because it makes you and your team more resilient in the long term. I have spoken to multiple leaders at the different companies I've worked at, and the number one quality that they say that defines a product manager's success is resilience. And in a crisis, if you can find new opportunities, that just ensures that you and your team become more critical to the company you're at. What are we going to cover today? We're going to start by talking about the different triggers that can precipitate a crisis for your team. We are then going to talk about how you should manage first your team, your product, your external stakeholders, and then yourself in such a situation. Lastly, we're going to cover a couple of different scenarios, what to expect and what you can do in those scenarios. What are some triggers of a crisis? There's, of course, I think very top of mind for all of us are unpredictable macroeconomic events like COVID-19, which is having widespread effects all across the world, not just on our work, but affecting people on a personal level. Another example of that would be the 2008 financial crisis, which led to a lot of layoffs and reprioritization among companies. There could be a reorganization of your team within the company. So overall, everything could be fine, but that maybe your team's priorities change, maybe your funding changes, your team composition changes, your mission changes, and that itself can also precipitate a crisis for your team. An influential leader could exit the company. This could be your CEO. This could be a very well-loved engineer on your team, or maybe a designer. And that could create feelings of uncertainty or trigger feelings of loss in the team. That could lead to a crisis as well. There could be damaging press about your company, which makes people uncertain about the future of the company and their place in it, and impacts their motivation to work. And then lastly, if you're a startup, loss in funding can trigger a pretty significant crisis on your team and what the future looks like for you. We are not going to cover all of these events, but the goal is that the framework I'm going to share in the next few minutes of this talk is going to help you deal with some of the fallout from situations like this. The first one I want to tackle is how to manage your team. Your team absolutely must be your top priority when you feel that you are in a crisis. One of the people I've worked with at Facebook, actually a very influential leader, he recently told us about how when he had worked in a submarine, what really made a big difference is the crazier things got around you, the calmer you had to become to be able to deal with them effectively. So the number one thing you must do is to help people slow down. And that means slowing down yourself. You need to take a pause, breathe, and reassess the situation to see what you should prioritize in this moment. We're going to talk a little bit more about prioritization on the next slide, but to start with, just making sure that you do not become frantic and get carried away just because the situation is escalating is very important for how your team reacts to it as well. The second one here has to do with empathy. I have been surprised with the variety of companies I've worked at. There have been situations where there's been a pretty significant crisis and everybody's been aware of it, but there has not been any clear communication, for example, from leadership or any transparency to next steps. And I've seen my teammates getting more anxious about their future as a result of that. And I've been in situations where leadership has predicted what's going to happen and has taken taken steps to proactively address these concerns and talk about solutions. But in all of these, things that have worked are making sure you're acknowledging the real challenges. It's fine to paint a bright picture of the future as long as you're also honestly acknowledging the current challenges that team are facing. And even more important, that in a situation, let's say, where productivity is disrupted, or if you're working from home like a lot of us are right now, that you encourage transparency and build trust. How can you do that? A really cool thing that I've seen a couple of our leaders do is what we call Ask Me Anything sessions. These can be on a weekly basis or on a bi-weekly basis, and you can do it at the personal level with you and your tech counterpart, or you can ask leadership on your team to do this, where you encourage people to ask the questions that are weighing on their mind and encourage your leadership to give honest answers to these questions. Another thing that I have found really useful recently is lean-in sessions. And this is important. I think these are primarily oriented for women, but they can also, of course, be male coworkers who participate. And these sessions just create a safe space where you might not find solutions, but you're at least sharing the concerns you have with each other, which makes you feel heard and that somebody else is able to empathize with the situation you're currently in. Another thing that's very important to be mindful of is that some people are going to be impacted disproportionately by a crisis. For example, in the current scenario of working from home, parents are affected in different ways than people who live with a partner or people who live by themselves. To be honest, everybody is facing a challenge. But if you have kids at home, and let's say if you're a mother, you might be facing a different kind of challenge than someone else. So acknowledging who those groups are who might be scared for their future because they are not doing as much work, or who are feeling burnt out because of the context switching that they have to do in terms of childcare and then coming back to work, it's important that you identify and make them feel heard. And if necessary, maybe encourage your leadership and you yourself to do smaller group sessions where you talk to them and understand what their problems are so you can find solutions to them. The last one is important because when a situation is emotionally fraught or you're anxious, of course, the tendency is to go solve the problem you're having. But people often forget that it's important to also distract the team from the problem occasionally by focusing on ways for them to feel connected and have fun. In the current situation, this has taken on a different form. For example, I do a virtual happy hour with my team once a week, where I have new people. So especially if new members have joined the team or even existing members take on the task of organizing a fun game everybody can play together. And that 1 hour, despite all the video conferences and meetings people are having, that 1 hour is something they really look forward to. So making sure that you're keeping the social fun aspect that helps your team bond in place is actually really important. Next, we're going to talk about how to manage your product. So you've looked at team health, you're conscious about how you can help them, but now it's about how can you manage your product better. The first thing that you should do really, and you should be doing this irrespective of whether you're in a crisis or not, but the very first thing to do is to ruthlessly prioritize the things you think you can do well, and then drop everything else. Often we are focused on trying to manage multiple different projects and products and making progress on all of them. In a crisis, you may not be able to do those things, either because productivity has been lowered or because it's difficult to get alignment or connect with others. In that situation, think of the 1 to 3 things that your team can do really well and have impact on, and then just say that anything else that is not something that can create significant impact in the next couple of months, you will not be doing, because it's better to make progress on these big bets than actually make slow incremental progress on much smaller ones. The second one is something not available to everybody, but if you can, I suggest you try it. And this is taking a risk on a new opportunity. every crisis you encounter will have both downsides and upsides to it. The upside is it might open a new window for you to invest in. An example is currently, if more people, for example, are working from home, there might be need for different kinds of products and experiences that help people as they're working from home or as they're isolating by themselves. Is there something you can do to help people in this time? Is there something you can do to help small businesses in this time? And is there a risk you can take with a new opportunity that you can sprint on really quickly with your team, that can be super mission oriented, that you can execute on quickly, that can then create a new window for your team and your company? The third one is something, again, you should be doing all the time as a product manager, but I think even more important in times of a crisis, especially one that has macroeconomic impacts. So monitoring your metrics. Ideally, there is, you measure your team goals and progress against goals using some metrics. And if you do, then you're looking at them on a weekly basis. In times of a crisis, so let's take COVID-19 for an example, you might see that the market is changing, how your consumers use your product is changing, or how you're able to even use your infrastructure. So if there's a computing cost associated with your product is also being impacted. It's very important then you and your team develop rigor in looking at your metrics every day, and then understand what's an anomaly versus the new normal. If you see a sudden spike in a metric and you continue to see it for a certain period of time, that might be the new normal you're operating in which case you should be thinking about maybe changing your goals or which metrics you use to show success against goals. And then if something is an anomaly, you also want to understand if it's a spike or if it's temporary or permanent, because it determines whether there's a problem in the system or if it's something you and your team need to address more deeply. So being especially careful at this time, I think, is very important. The last one is something I think that will help with both orienting your team towards a specific goal and also helping with setting expectations externally. And that is having clear milestones with timing to stay on track. This is something we should usually be doing as well. But as you're reprioritizing, try to make the milestones you set for your team less open-ended, more specific, more narrow, and things that you think are realistic for your team to deliver. So now that we have spoken about how you can manage your team and product, the next thing is how to manage your external stakeholders. Product managers often work with many stakeholders, and within your team, that can be your engineers, your designers, your content strategists, your data scientists, and then there could be other external stakeholders who are your business leads, your marketing team, your leadership team, your C team in general. How do you manage them well in a time when visibility is impacted, ability to actually create impact is also impacted? The first one here is actually setting clear expectations on what you and your team can deliver and how you're measuring success against goals at that time. Doing this is really important because as you reprioritize while your team might very well understand what you're doing, it might not be clear to external stakeholders, so that communication early on, done as simply and clearly as possible, is important as well. And if you think you're changing how you're measuring success, so if you're changing a metric or you're changing, let's say, the guardrail you have on some metrics saying you would have done something and increase it by 5%, but now you can only do it by 2%, then it's important to communicate that and why you are re-goaling as well, so that they know how to measure success for you and your team. The second one is around communication. Sharing weekly updates on your team's progress, what's blocking them, and how are individuals contributing to your team's success is again something you should be following as a best practice anyway. But this becomes ever more critical when you are in a crisis. And it has a twofold impact. First, it creates visibility for your team and makes sure they're staying on track. The second one is it motivates them. I think we often underscore the importance of recognizing people and the impact of a kind word on their motivation. So try at this time to recognize individual people by praising them, by calling them out, by sharing if something important was shipped, who was involved in shipping it and how did they contribute. In a time like this, especially when performance reviews have become far more difficult to do, evaluation is going to be more challenging, by having written communication on a regular basis to reward people and call out their accomplishments will go a long way in helping your team shine. The third one is around cutting through all the noise that will inevitably happen when there's a crisis. So there's going to be more communication happening, either over your more chat channels or over through emails or any intranet that you have in the company. So it's important that you find a clear way to communicate that really resonates with people. So an example of this is if your team is working with a different one whose help you need to operationalize something or execute on something, and there's a dependency on them that's pretty critical to your success, make sure that you're capturing those requests in writing. The reason for doing this is, especially in this new work from home environment we are in, as people are constantly reprioritizing and adjusting to this new normal, things will drop and they will forget. And it's going to be really hard for you to know until it's too late. So to have that request and commitment in writing shared out is just a common way of everybody holding each other accountable to their promises. The second one here is, of course, reaching out for periodic updates on priority. We often say communicate early and communicate often. And while this should not be something where you're constantly distracting that team by asking them for updates, but have some regular cadence at which both of you are aware of how things are going, because it can be a check on your project success. The next one here is on how to set expectations. This is a mini course because I feel often it's very obvious to us what we should be doing, but we don't know maybe how to articulate that clearly. And we often realize late in the game that the team has been suffering from lack of direction or specificity that has impacted their ability to perform. It's more important than ever that if you are in a crisis, that you set those expectations really clearly. So if you're reprioritizing what your team's charter is in a reorg, for example, or if you have a new set of projects to go after because COVID-19 has impacted your team a little bit differently, then it's important to clearly and simply articulate three things. First, the problem your team is solving. And this could be just stating the problem my team is solving is making sure that people have better experiences during the checkout flow, if let's say you work at an e-commerce company. And then talking about what winning looks like. So in this case, what winning looks like could be winning looks like a customer being able to transact and check out with maximum satisfaction during the very first time that they try to check out with the product. And then how do you expect to get there? So now that you've painted the vision of that beautiful future, talk about what are the steps that's required that will help you get there. And the steps that you articulate here is really what your team is then going to go execute on. One way to do this, flowing from here, is then setting objectives and key results of meeting those objectives so that they can guide the project. So an example here is the objective is to reduce friction in people's checkout experiences. And the key results that will help you determine whether you have succeeded at that objective are having a one-click checkout page, for example, having autofill and for shipping and billing details, and then maybe integrating a new payment method. And this will help you have very clear objectives for the team to go after. Last, we come to how to managing yourself. I think product managers often forget that given the burden that they have to take on in managing team health, managing product health, and the fact that really the buck stops at them, that they themselves are humans who need to get in touch with how they're feeling about a situation, how they're coping with it. A few things I have found useful for myself and some of my coworkers in these times is first is allowing myself the mental space to actually process the situation. You are the person on the ground who's expected to come up with a plan, making sure your team is coping well with this emotionally and able to still create impact. There's a lot going on. So have some realistic expectations for yourself. You're not going to be operating in the same normal as you usually do. So give yourself the time and space to process and understand that better. Another important thing is also to take periodic breaks from work and encourage the same for your team. We are more at risk than ever to be getting burnt out because we don't know when we should stop working, when we should stop working. Weekdays and weekends tend to just blend into each other. So it's important sometimes to just step away. If I feel like I cannot have a conversation with someone either over a meeting or in another forum where I see myself overreacting to the situation or getting very frustrated with it, I'll just put my hands up, take a step back and say, I just need to take a beat and then come back to you. And that's what you should do. And you should encourage your team to do the same, including taking PTO days a little more often so that you can give your brain the time and space to think. Another one that's important is having a good support system in place so you have somebody to talk to. And this can be another work buddy who might not be in your immediate team, or a support group. Let's say if there's a lean-in circle or just like a product manager circle that you can create where you talk to other people from your team, other people across the company who understand the problems you're facing and help you process them together. If your work has slowed down and you feel like your team is not able to execute on the same projects as you would have in a different world, well, then try to take a class and maybe build a new skill. I think often learning and shifting your brain away from going after a challenge and trying to do something different where you're trying to solve your way through a new problem in a setting like a class can actually be quite refreshing and reorient your brain to think differently in a time of crisis. Lastly, this is really just a tip that I found incredibly helpful as I go through many, many meetings every day, as I'm sure all of us do, is that if you have a lot of one-on-one meetings, especially through video conferencing, it can get really exhausting and it can be hard to absorb details and be present and mindful during them. Try taking some of them maybe while you're walking, or if there's like an indoor exercise equipment that you can use while doing it, or if you're sitting outside just to get some fresh air. But of course, remembering that you should stay safe while you're trying to do so. We are now going to move on to a case study. The first one is, of course, dealing with, I think, what a lot of us are, which is COVID-19 or a similar macroeconomic event. What can you expect in a situation like this? You can expect that there'll be lower productivity on your team. People are working from home. They're stressed. There's a lot else going on. So this is an inevitable effect. There will be difficulty in building consensus. If you are trying to get a bunch of different teams or even a bunch of different people on the same team to align on a specific topic, that can be a lot more challenging when you're working from home, or if people are trying to just cope with a crisis like a reorg inside a company. And then less visibility on progress. This is, of course, a constant concern for everybody who wants their team to shine. In a situation like this, you might feel that it's harder for your team to showcase their impact. Well, what are some things you can do to actually address this? First one we talked about earlier, which is reprioritize your roadmap to focus on high impact projects. I cannot stress the importance of this enough, because not only will this help your team create more impact, but it will help them from feeling less overwhelmed if they're not trying to do the same number of things that they were trying to do pre-crisis. The second one, in building consensus. In an usual scenario, if you wanted to build consensus or get alignment on a project, you might have gone and spoken in an office to 10 different people. Then you might have had a large meeting with all of them and maybe even a few others to make sure everybody stamps that proposal and is comfortable with it. That is not realistic in this new scenario living in. And while we should still attempt to be as egalitarian as possible, I think it's also important to be realistic. So focus on the few key decision makers whose consensus really matters. So if you're thinking of running a new project, who's going to fund that project? Who are the people who are going to contribute resources to that project? Those are the people you need to get consensus from first. And once you have, let's say, a very solid draft of all of these key people having agreed on it, and so trying to do meetings with them, making sure you're doing small group meetings to give people an opportunity to speak, then you can share those results out a little more broadly and invite feedback from people to answer any remaining questions, versus trying to get consensus from 20 people at the same time on your first go. The last one, again, we touched upon this a little bit earlier, which is communicate early and often. And of course, you can do weekly updates, but also it's important, I think, when you're in a crisis to show a different side to those updates. It can actually be pretty enlightening. And you can also, I think, increase readership for the updates you're sharing out by maybe adding a personal touch with something inspirational or funny. For example, in the updates I share out, I usually talk about a new book or show I have seen that week that has really interested me, or something new I cooked that week, or something that happened to an important thing that happened to our team member, someone who had a baby, for example. And then recognizing individual contributions more frequently as well. So calling out who did what, and making sure that they feel good about the work that they're actually doing. More important than ever is, as you're doing these communications more frequently, that you also find a way to keep it simple and short. People are going to be reading a lot more right now than they would in other times, simply because written communication is an easier way to get work done. So make sure that anything you have can be translated in just like in simple sentences by everybody who's reading it. So attempting to get to as broad an audience as possible, and making sure that it's like captured very succinctly so that they can get through it quickly and they enjoy reading it. A second case study here is the scenario in which there's a reorganization of your team within the company. This can, I think, be even more pertinent, especially to people who work in larger companies, but to smaller ones as well. What usually happens in this situation? Your team is asked to work on a new project. Maybe some people are asked to leave. And this can lead to a sense of loss of direction within the team, anxiety about the team's future, and how they can create impact. What are some things you as a product manager can do? Well, first, check in as early with your team as possible once you know of something of this happening, so that you can provide some direction or next steps. You may not have all the answers, and that's fine. This is more about providing them with some comfort and certainty in a time when there isn't a lot of it. Acknowledge their feelings and understand that it's a difficult situation, and then try and emphasize the positive impacts, positive aspects of a new opportunity. So for example, this can be a scenario where your team's charter has completely changed, or there's a new project you've been staffed on, and maybe with fewer people on it. In this case, you could potentially emphasize the fact that being a leaner team can help you operate more quickly and deliver more impact in some situations, and go after riskier bets. You can immediately also start tasking people with researching or defining the new problems they can solve in this area. Sitting idle without work on their plates might just give them more time to mull over the situation. So giving them some direction and helping to veer their energies in a positive area by figuring out what's the next big problem to solve here can be quite productive. And then the last one is, as a product manager, you should be creating a new charter and mission for your team so that you can give them a sense of identity and purpose. Ideally, you're working on this with a couple of leaders or individual contributors from within your team, so that people feel that they know what the future is going to bring for them, and they feel that you're the ideal person to lead them into that future. So to quickly summarize some of the takeaways from this talk, as things speed up, help people slow down. Help them stay calm by staying calm yourself, and then prioritizing a few big bets versus trying to make progress on many small things. Communicate expectations early and often, and share progress and goals and recognize achievements more publicly. Have a clear vision, milestones, and expected results to motivate your team. And then at the end, give yourself the time and space to process these challenges and make sure that you are investing some time in self-care. I hope you all found this useful. I've had a really great time sharing my learnings here. Thank you.